Children with communication, language, and speech disorders. Historically, in the 1800s, the U.S. public schools focused on proper and elegant speech, or elocution. In 1872, the School of Vocal Physiology, Alexander Graham Bell was the founder, and this addressed deafness, articulation issues, and stuttering. And in 1924, ASHA began the emerging field of speech and language pathology. Focusing on linguistics, Noam Chomsky in the 1960s and 70s, he was very active in children's acquisition of language. He created the idea of a language acquisition device. And what this is he believes that humans are genetically able to develop any language that they hear. And later, as they are focusing in on what they typically hear, then they prune out the sounds that they don't hear. When we talk about the brain, there are several areas that specialize in language. The Broca area, which you can see is towards the front and center. This area of the brain focuses on language production and comprehension. The Wernicke's area, and that is more towards the middle back. This focuses on written and spoken language. And then the angular gyrus, which is towards the upper back of the brain, focuses on reading, writing, and interpretation of language. So if we look at our information processing model in regards to language, you can see that the primary effect of language disorders, speech and language disorders, is the speaking part of response in the triad of attention, thinking, and response. And then associated with that is social interactions. So when we look at the process of communication, here we outline that there is a sender. Are you in my Ed 250 class? There is a message that he just sent, and the receiver is thinking, I wonder what he means. Does he want to study together? Does he like me? Will he ask me out? And when communication takes place, in this communication process here, we're using the 5 rule systems of language, starting at the very bottom with sounds, phonology, which are the building blocks of language, the sounds put together in words, which is the next level, morphology, syntax, which is those words put together in sentences and the grammar of doing that, semantics, which is the meaning of what's being said, and then pragmatics is the meaning in context, like how many ways can this be interpreted. So you can see communication is a pretty complex process. So when we define language, language is a symbolic system used to communicate about objects, events, and ideas. There are 2 types of language. There's receptive language, and that's the ability to take in and understand the message that's being communicated. And expressive language, this is the ability to produce the message. And as we saw in our diagram of the 2 individuals communicating about coursework, there's language form, which has to do with phonology, morphology, and syntax. There's language context, which is the semantics or meanings, and language function, which is the pragmatics or social use of language. Speech is the oral production of the words of a language, And there are three aspects of speech. There's articulation, which is the clear pronunciation of the sounds and the words. Fluency, which is the appropriate flow. And then voice is the intonation and quality of the speech. So there are certain mechanisms involved in producing speech. There's respiration, which is breathing, and you can see that in the bottom of our diagram with the lungs. And this generates the energy to make the sound. Phonation, if we move up, phonation is the vibration of the vocal cords to produce sounds, and you can see that in the neck area. Resonation gives the voice the unique characteristics of the individual, and that has to do with the area just underneath the ear. And then articulation is the movement of the mouth and tongue that makes the phoneme sounds. And then, of course, we can't forget about the thought that goes along with that at the very top. So let's talk about then the process of language development. Children develop both receptive and expressive language during early childhood. And this is actually a critical period. And what that means is if language isn't developed during this time, there are many aspects of language that cannot be intervened in regards to and will never be able to be achieved later in development. So the process begins with crying, and there are several types of crying. There's anger, pain, comfort, boredom, and the role of a caregiver is to figure out which cry is being exhibited and then help to meet that child's need. Crying always communicates a need. It's not about manipulation. Gustatory sounds made just as you move your body, as you breathe, things like that. Of course, there's body language like smiles, eye contact, and gestures. And then the very beginning of the expressive aspect of language starts with cooing. And this is vowel sounds. And it's oohs and ahs. And it is more of a sing-song approach, and it's very soothing to those that hear it and to the child that makes these sounds. Babbling is combining vowels with the consonants, and this is things like mama, dada, baba, dada, and it eventually these babbles turn into first words when a child realizes that mama means a female that takes care of them because of the reaction that the mama has when they say that, or even dada. They realize when the individual gets all excited and hugs them and gives them lots of attention. One day they realize, oh, that babble stands for that individual. Holophrases are when a child uses one word for an entire message. They may say dada and mean pick me up, dada. A telegraphic speech is 2 or 3 word phrases where they can more accurately communicate. So they may say dada up. So these processes have about 2 or 3 month gaps in between each, with the exception of the crying, gustatory, and smiles and eye contact. These are there from the very beginning. So when we talk about disorders in this area, this gives us a classification of the American Speech and Language Hearing Association's definition of communication disorders, including language and speech. So a communication disorder involves difficulties with receiving, sending, processing, and comprehending or comprehending verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbolic information. They may be mild or severe or may coexist with other disabilities. A speech disability involves the articulation of speech sounds, fluency, and/or voice, and could be, as we mentioned earlier, an articulation disorder where the sounds are distorted, may be unintelligible due to substitutions, omissions, or additions of phonemes. A fluency disorder means that the flow of speech is characterized by differences in the rate or rhythm and the repetition of speech sounds and syllables, words, and phrases. A voice disorder is the quality of voice that's atypical given the speaker's gender and age. It just sounds different than what is usual. Pitch may be too high or low, volume may be inappropriate, and differences may include resonance and duration of sound. And then lastly, a language disorder involves difficulties with any combination of spoken, written, or symbol systems used to share ideas and messages. Language disorders could impact understanding and use of language, then language context and language function. That all of these things we talked about earlier. So then to look at it in summary, a communication disorder is an impairment of the ability to receive, send, process, and comprehend concepts of communication. And this can often be a secondary disability for children with many other disabilities such as intellectual and developmental delays, cerebral palsy, and hearing loss. A language disorder is an impairment in comprehension and/or the use of language in the form of language, the content, and the function. Speech disorders include articulation errors, substitutions, distortions, omissions, additions, voice, dysphonia, which has to do with quality, the pitch of the voice and the loudness of the voice, fluency, rate, rhythm, repetitions, and stuttering, and may originate because of a physical anomaly such as a cleft palate, which is the roof of the mouth is not sealed together, and that may include the lip. So let's look at the cultural and linguistic context. So children who are bilingual may seem to develop speech more slowly. If they are referred for assessment, they should be assessed in their primary language, and their bilingual ability should be accounted for. Dialect is the variation of language that differs in pronunciation, vocabulary, or syntax, and is not a speech disorder. Although a dialect could mask a speech problem. So then when we assess communicative disorders, there are different ways that it might be exhibited. It might be exhibited, for example, with phonology. Receptively, a child has difficulty hearing different speech sounds. And when we say hearing, what we really mean is differentiating between different speech sounds. Expressive language for phonology would be the child's articulation of speech sounds that's impaired. For morphology and syntax, then, for receptive language, the child has difficulty understanding grammar or language structures, not based on cultural dialect or linguistic differences. Or the child uses, for expressive language, a child uses inappropriate grammar or language structure. Semantics, when we look at receptive language, the child has difficulty understanding needs, ideas, wants, feelings, and thoughts of others. And with expressive, they have difficulty expressing their own needs, ideas, wants, feelings, and thoughts through language. And then lastly, pragmatics. And this, under receptive, a child has difficulty interpreting the speaker's motivations. And for expressive, the child has difficulty adjusting communication to the social context and the demands. So then how do we provide services in organizational structures for children with speech, language, and communication disorders? 87% of children with speech and language disorders spend 80% or more of their day in general education classrooms. So when we talk about RTI at Tier 1, we provide rich language environments in general education classrooms coupled with appropriate supports. In Tier 2, we focus on small group enhancement activities, and in Tier 3, it's individualized services to meet IEP goals. So when we look at curriculum and instruction, students may be supported by a speech and language pathologist in the general classroom or in out-of-classroom sessions, and communication goals will appear on their IEP. English language learners need support in both academic and social language development. And then with assistive technology, we can improve a child with severe communication disorders' ability to communicate. So when we look at family and lifespan issues, families are the earliest teachers of language and play a key role in intervention for children with communicative disorders. So they really need to be on board and trained in regards to what are the best approaches and why would schools address issues in certain ways. The speech and language pathologist can work with the family to teach parents and caregivers strategies to improve a child's speech and language skills. And most children with speech and language disorders not associated with other disabilities have limited problems transitioning to adult life.